Howdy, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the History of Christianity. We're on part 38 today. We're going to be talking about roots of reform as we near the end of this particular study, but look forward to the dawn of the Protestant Reformation. Begin today by talking about John Huss. John Huss was a famous preacher and scholar, and he became rector of the University of Prague in 1402. A number of Czechs who had studied in England brought the writings of Wycliffe to the university. So we talked about Wycliffe last week, and many of his writings were very influential in this dawn age right before the start of the Protestant Reformation. And so his writings had now been brought into Europe and had moved its way into this area, and they became very influential in this area. The division between Czechs and Germans at the university mirrored the division between those accepting and those rejecting Wycliffe's philosophy. The Czechs accepted it and the Germans rejected it. Huss defended Wycliffe, though he did not agree with him on the issue of transubstantiation. So we know that Wycliffe took exception to the doctrine of transubstantiation because that doctrine says that during communion, the elements actually transform and they're no longer a bread, no longer a wine. They become the literal body and blood of Jesus Christ. Wycliffe said that this was not correct. He said that just as it was in the incarnation, the actual flesh does not go away. It's not destroyed in the incarnation. So the divine being brought into union with the human being didn't just leave the divine itself. And so he says that that's the way that it is in communion as well. You can't say that the bread and wine are no longer there and only the body and blood of Christ. He said that it would be both, that the body and the blood were there, but also the bread and the wine. Well, Huss didn't agree with this. He agreed with what was the orthodox view at the time, and yet there was still enough from Wycliffe that he did agree with that he defended him. Eventually, the Czechs won out, and the German teachers left to start a new university in Leipzig. On their way out, the German teachers declared Prague a hotbed of heresies. So the Germans were not really in line with what the Czechs were teaching. They didn't like it at all, and they weren't going to leave quietly. They were going to go away, but they weren't going to go away quietly. So they made accusations against the Czechs, said that basically those that were in Prague in that area it was nothing but heresy there. And because of that, the rest of the world began to have the impression that the Czechs were heretics. So the groundwork had already been laid to thinking of them in that light. The Archbishop of Prague clashed with Huss. He obtained a papal decree banning the works of Wycliffe and also ordering that preaching take place only in cathedrals, parish churches, and monasteries. You might be thinking, why would there be any kind of order about where preaching could take place? Why was that important? What did that have to do with this particular issue? Well, they were trying to silence Huss. And it happened that Huss preached from the pulpit of the Chapel of Bethlehem. That particular place doesn't fit into any of these categories. It wasn't a cathedral, it wasn't a parish church, and it wasn't a monastery. So that particular edict was made for only one reason, and that was it was made in an effort to silence Huss. But it didn't work. Huss decided he could not obey, and he kept on preaching anyway. In 1410, Huss was summoned to Rome. He refused to go and was excommunicated in 1411. So definitely the church leaders didn't like what he was teaching. They didn't like this reform idea that was out there when it came to doctrinal things. There was definitely reform when it came to some of the corruption in the church, although not all of it, but there wasn't any desire among the church leadership to have reform when it came to the doctrines of the church. And so any time these kind of sprang up, they tried to quiet them down quickly. You think of Wycliffe and you say, well, how did he get away with it? Well, he got away with it because he was in England. And at that time, England wasn't real happy with the church because the Pope at the time was in France. And because of the 100 Years' War, England and France were against each other. That meant England was not great with the church leadership of the Pope at all. And so they tolerated Wycliffe. They accepted him at first, eventually didn't, but still tolerated him. And he didn't end up like some of these guys are going to end up, as you'll find out. And his teachings got to continue to be out there. And here's one more guy who is taking on the same idea that there are some issues with doctrines in the church. There are some issues with even church leadership, and they need to be addressed. So let's look at what the views of Huss were that would have been a problem. Huss had the support of the king and the people of Bohemia, so the excommunication had little effect. Then Huss became more radical. So as the church is standing up against him, he has the support of the people where he's at, so he's fine. The excommunication doesn't matter. They're not going to take that up. He's going to continue to do what he's doing, and as a result, he's emboldened and he becomes more radical in his views. Huss came to the conclusion that an unworthy pope is not to be obeyed. He questioned the pope's authority when they were acting for their own interests rather than the welfare of the church. So when you're talking about radical views, you're probably thinking something that would just be crazy, something that nobody would go along with or would just be so wildly out there. But in this case, what was looked at the time as a radical view was that any leader who only cared about their own self-interest rather than the welfare of the church, that leader was invalid. They shouldn't be in that position. It doesn't seem like a radical view, but it was at the time. People weren't standing up against leadership, and there was absolute authority given to the Pope. That has started to crumble. And as more people see that there's corruption in the church, that these men who are in authority positions are really more interested in looking out for their own benefit rather than for the welfare of the church, people are coming to the conclusion that there's an issue here and it needs to be stood up against. And Huss was one of the ones who helped to do this, and he made what we would all consider to be, well, I shouldn't say all, where many people would consider to be a very reasonable statement in his day and time was considered to be a radical statement. Huss declared that the Bible is the final authority by which the Pope or any Christian was to be judged. Again, is that a radical view? Maybe not today, especially in light of the Protestant Reformation and the number of Protestants in the world. Protestantism would largely agree with this, maybe universally agree with this. The time in which this statement was made, it was a radical view. It was not agreed with. The leadership of the church, the Pope, would have supremacy, and to stand anything against the Pope, to even have an idea that the Pope would be in conflict with the Bible anyway, was just not something that people were willing to accept, or at least it wasn't something that the leadership at the time was going to allow to go unchecked. John the 23rd, who was one of three popes at the time, proclaimed a crusade against Naples, mostly for reasons of Italian politics. He financed the crusade by the sale of indulgences. So as we look at this, a crusade, we think of a crusade as the armed conflict or the armed conquerors going into the Holy Land, trying to reclaim what they felt like originally belonged to the church and Christianity. After that time was over, the Pope still used that same idea, but they used it locally. So they would go and get armies to go up against people that were heretical or they deemed were heretical. But they would also use it just to attack another region, other Christians in other parts of the country or of Europe. And that was what was happening here. And it was happening because it would be an advantage for John the 23rd. It wasn't anything that had to do with a legitimate reason to have any kind of armed conflict, which I'm not sure that there is when it comes to Christianity anyway. But what's worse is not only did he want to have this crusade for selfish reasons, but he also financed it by the sale of indulgences. You may remember this as being a big issue in the Protestant Reformation, which it certainly was, but it wasn't just then. It started before that. Huss had come to the conclusion that only God can grant forgiveness, and to sell what can only be given by God is a usurpation. He was also unhappy with a war among Christians being declared simply to further a pope's ambitions. So Huss said, this is not right. It's not okay to sell these indulgences. Only God can grant forgiveness. And for the church to say, or a pope to say, I'm the one that can do that, that person has taken the place of God. They're claiming to be able to grant something that only God can do. So he was unhappy about that. And he was certainly unhappy that there's a war being declared among Christian brothers. And to make matters worse, it was being done just for the Pope's ambitions. Again, in our day and time, we look at this and say that is legitimate. That's right on. In the time in which this was happening, it was looked at as a radical idea. The king, needing Pope John's support, ordered Huss to silence his protests. But by then, his views were known. They were out there. And there were public demonstrations against the papacy. So people have started to realize, you know what, this guy is probably right. And the king is needing Pope John's support, but he may not get it because his own subjects are demonstrating against the Pope. And, of course, the Pope is not like that. John the 23rd excommunicated Huss again. So he said, I excommunicated you once, it didn't seem to help. But I got the king on my side now, so let me see if excommunicating you again helps. Well, at this point, Huss decided that for the good of the country, that he would leave Prague and move to the countryside to continue his writings on the needed Reformation. Everybody seemed to be happy with that. He got to leave. He wasn't there stirring people up, so the king was happy, the Pope was happy, but he could still write about the issues that he saw. So that kind of worked out for a little while, but something happened. Before the Great Council of Constance, so we've talked already about the Council of Constance, one of these great councils that was happening in an effort to try to bring reform, didn't necessarily do a great job of it. But before that council was going to come up, Emperor Sigismund, who was the most powerful emperor in Europe at the time, he invited Huss to attend in order to defend himself before the assembly. So the emperor is thinking, you know what, we can get this guy in front of this council. He can make his defense, and maybe we can smooth everything out over. I want to help him out. Well, is it a good idea if you've already got a bunch of people in the church leadership mad at you? Is it a good idea to go before a big assembly of them? Maybe not. And yet Huss accepted the invitation. And so he went to the Council of Constance. Why would Huss do this? Why would he put himself in harm's way? Well, he didn't see it that way. Huss saw this council as the opportunity for a new age of the church. He hoped to contribute to what he thought would be the great Reformation enacted by the council. So Huss took seriously what supposedly was going to be the reason for even having this council, and that was to bring reform. And he's thinking, okay, I'm the reform guy. I'm one of the ones who wants reform. So I would be crazy to miss out on this opportunity. I want to help contribute. I want to be in charge. I want to run the agenda. I want to contribute to this. And so he thought this is an opportunity too good to pass up. Well, you heard that old saying, sometimes when things seem too good to be true, they probably are. Well, you're about to see Huss found that out. Instead, upon arriving in Constance, Huss was taken before Pope John in order to recant his heresy. So as soon as John got wind that Huss was coming, he knew this was his chance. I'm going to get him as soon as he gets in town. Now, understand this. King Sigismund had given Huss assurances that for safe conduct, that he would be able to come safely, that he would be protected, that nothing bad would happen to him, and he would be able to go home without any problem. So he gave him that promise, but it doesn't seem like he really did anything to help with this, because as soon as Huss shows up, he's taken before the Pope, who don't like him at all, and he's told, you are a heretic, you recant now. Huss agreed. I'll absolutely recant from any heresy I have, but you're going to have to show me what that is. If anyone here can show and prove that I am a heretic or anything I've said is heretical, then I'll be glad to recant. That didn't go over very well. So from that point, Huss was treated like a prisoner. And eventually they kind of shuffled him around in some houses and other places. Eventually he ended up in cells in various monasteries. So prison cells. So I don't know if you think like me, but my first thought when I read this was, what in the world are jail cells doing in monasteries? I haven't read enough into this to even be able to answer that question, why they had cells there. But evidently they did, and enough of them had them that they could shuffle him around. So Huss is in jail at the monasteries. He's being shuffled around. No safe conduct has been given to him. Nobody's coming to try to help him. He is a prisoner now. Emperor Sigismund, who invited Huss and guaranteed him safe conduct, at first defended him. So at first the emperor tried to stand up for him, but He didn't get anywhere with the church leadership, and he finally just decided, you know what, this is not worth my effort. So he just washed his hands of the whole affair. He just said, you know what, the juice ain't worth the squeeze here. So I'm going to just step back. I'm going to keep out of it. Let the church deal with Huss. It ain't worth my time anyway. Yeah, I know I promised him safe conduct, but what's anybody going to do about it? So he steps back, and now Huss is truly and completely at the mercy of the church leadership at the Council of Constance. And Huss did appear before the council on June 5th, 1415. Huss was taken there before the council. A few days earlier, if you'll remember again from our previous episode, Pope John the 23rd had been told that, guess what? You're not going to be Pope anymore. We're 3 popes is nonsense. We got to get down to 1. And, oh, you were thinking we were going to support you? Well, not really. You need to step down. Well, he didn't like that. He fled the city. But at this point, he'd been brought back as a prisoner. So the guy that's been against Huss is now a prisoner. So Huss is probably thinking, and he actually did have hope, that would bring him favor before the council. So you're standing up against John? Oh, I was too. Let's go together. We're good on this. It didn't happen that way. This was not to be. The council desired to make a strong stand for orthodoxy. And the position that the church had taken, the leadership had taken, was that Huss was not in alignment with orthodoxy. He was actually accused of heresy. And they wanted to show that they were strongly standing against heresy. Now, that in and of itself is not a bad thing. The church needs to be against heresy. But the church also needs to realize that just because somebody doesn't go lockstep along with you doesn't mean that they're necessarily heretical. Maybe their position is correct and you're wrong. Well, they didn't look at things like that in that way back then. They didn't look at it like that during this council either. And Huss appeared before the assembly in chains. He wasn't brought in as oh, you know what, our bad. You were against Pope John. We are too. Let's all be friends. He was brought again to have to answer for himself. The council told Huss all he had to do was recant. Basically just say you're wrong, say you're sorry, and we're good. We'll let you go. You can go home. You can hang out for the rest of the council. Go sit up in the wherever and watch the whole thing. Go back home, tell everybody your story. You're all good. But Huss was a man of principle. He wasn't going to do that. He replied that he could not do that because he never held the doctrines of which they accused him. So Huss felt like he was being falsely accused, and he wasn't going to say, I'm sorry for saying something that I didn't say. Besides that, to recant would be to admit he was a heretic, and he's not going to do it. Sorry, I know that would make it easy for me just to say I was a heretic, I'm sorry, and you're willing to let me go. That's great. But guess what? I'm not saying that. I don't feel like anything I said was heretical. I don't feel like I have anything to apologize for, and I'm not going to admit to saying things I didn't say. So that's not going to be a solution. Finally, Huss declared, I appeal to Jesus Christ, the only judge who is almighty and completely just. In his hands I place my cause, since he will judge each, not on the basis of false witnesses and erring counsels, but of truth and justice. And with that, Huss was sent back to prison. So he made a statement, took a couple of little digs there at the leadership, took a dig on the council there, and said, basically, I appeal to Jesus. And the council said, okay, well, you can go back to your cell and talk to Jesus about it. And they sent him back. So things didn't go much better from there. Many went to the prison to plead for Huss to recant. So he had some friends, some other people that knew he was well respected, that knew there were going to be those upset about him being mistreated. They didn't want the council to get a bad name. And they just tried to say, come on, man, just tell them what they want to hear. Just recant. Just say you're sorry. You can have your fingers crossed behind your back, whatever. Just say it. No, he wasn't going to do it. I'm not doing that. Not going to happen. And so finally, on July 6th, Huss was taken to the cathedral. He was dressed in his priestly garments, which were then torn from him. His tonsure was shaved, and on his head was placed a paper crown decorated with demons. I don't know who was there making paper. Maybe there were some kids around making paper crowns. They grabbed one and threw some demons on there, drew them on. I don't know how they knew what a demon looked like. I don't know any of there's a lot of questions about this. What was the point of it? I guess they were just trying to say he was a demon for being a heretic. and let's make him look as bad as he can. So it's kind of like the scene where you see the guy in the military that's been tried and convicted, and they take him out and they rip off his badges and ribbons and whatever on his uniform. It's kind of thing here. They ripped his garments off, his priestly garments, shaved his head. They're about to burn him anyway. I don't know why they needed to shave his head, and then put this paper crown with demons. So not a great day for Huss. Huss was led past a pyre where his books were being burnt. So it's not enough that we're going to kill you, but we're going to let you see that we're burning your books on top of it. And then he was tied to the stake and prepared to be burned. Huss was given one last opportunity to recant. And you kind of hear this with most of these stories. Come on. Just one last time. Just say you're sorry. Just admit it. That's all you got to do. We'll let you out. Your hair will grow back. And you can take that goofy crown off. Just recant. Not going to happen. He refused, and instead he prayed aloud, Lord Jesus, it is for thee that I patiently endure this cruel death. I pray thee to have mercy on my enemies. So this takes you back to the martyrs being killed and kind of the same things that they said, the same thoughts they had, the same things they vocalized. And even back to Jesus himself on the cross saying, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. So in the same vein, but the sad part of it is this wasn't a bunch of ignorant Roman soldiers and people that didn't really understand what was happening, killing Jesus. This wasn't a pagan government killing Christians for their faith. These were Christians killing another Christian man because they just weren't willing to let anybody be out of line. And it's such a sad thing to read through the history of Christianity and find some of these stories, and there's a lot of them. Christians were no longer being killed for their faith by people outside of Christianity. They were being killed for their faith now by people that were supposedly inside Christianity. You can see why there needed to be reform. And even anyone that may be listening to this that is not of the Protestant faith, that's absolutely fine. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to agree with the tenets of it. But you have to admit, this kind of stuff is nonsense. This is not the way to go about doing things in any biblical sense. And I don't care what the leadership says. The leadership should be respected. But you also are supposed to be in a position to earn respect. And all these guys were saying through this was Jesus was a servant. He flat out said, whoever wants to be great needs to be the least. The last shall be first. I mean, there's no question about this. Jesus got down on his knees and took the position of the lowest person in the house and washed the feet of his disciples. And yet somebody that had the nerve to even question a person in authority gets killed and burned at the stake for it. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it's a black mark in the history of Christianity, but it's one we need to remember and pray and hope that nothing like that ever happens again. Huss, as he was burned, recited the Psalms. A few days later, his colleague, Jerome of Prague, was also burned. So his kind of the guy that had been his big friend during all this, that agreed with him and also went with the teachings of Wycliffe, they rounded him up and burned him too, just for good measure. The Bohemians were indignant and almost unanimously repudiated the crimes of the council. And I'll put that word in there, the crimes of the council, because these were crimes. This is not acceptable on any level what they did to this man. And his countrymen were not okay with it. They didn't go along with the leadership either. Now, they were safe back at home, but as a voice in a time in which a lot of people were afraid to speak, they spoke out and said, no, this is wrong. So the Bohemians are not having this. You promised us that you would hear what he had to say, and all this amounted to was a trial to kill him? No, this is not okay. And it even cemented the idea that the leadership was absolutely out of control and somebody needed to stand up for what was right. Well, the council, as you can imagine, didn't agree with that, so they countered by ordering that the University of Prague be dissolved. They summoned the rebellious nobles to Constance. So they basically said, why don't you 452 come over here and we'll deal with you here. And then they declared that the king of Bohemia was abetting heresy. So There is definitely not agreement between these two parties as to what's going on here. And this led to a big Bohemian resistance. In Bohemia, groups among the nobles and the lower classes rose up in opposition to the council. These groups joined to agree on 4 articles that would become the basis for resistance. The first was that the word of God was to be preached freely throughout the kingdom. The second, that communion would be given in both kinds. That is, that the cup and not only the bread was to be given to the laity. This was a conclusion that Huss had reached toward the end of his life, and which soon became one of the main demands of all Hussites. Third, all agreed that the clergy should be deprived of its wealth and live in apostolic poverty. Finally, the 4th article stated that gross and public sin, especially simony, would be properly punished. So these 4 articles are pretty reasonable. The idea that the word of God would be preached freely, how can anybody disagree with that? Well, there were some that did. The communion, they wanted to get communion straightened out, and then that the clergy should not become wealthy off of their church positions, and they should live as the apostles did. And then lastly, that all this corruption in the church, especially simony, would be properly punished, and we'd finally get rid of that. So very reasonable things that were the basis of absolutely needed reform. And Bohemia put these together, and they stood up for them. King Gonzalez, who was the king at the time, died there. So the king in Bohemia died. And that left Emperor Sigismund as his successor. So it was rightfully the kingdom now for Sigismund to take. But the Hussites had some demands for him before he could take over, and he didn't want to go along with those. He didn't agree with them. And so he requested that the Pope call a crusade against the Hussites. So now Sigismund is going up against the group that he originally was trying to support by bringing Huss to the council in Constance to begin with. So in a way, Sigismund has kind of caused this problem for himself by, first of all, opening the can of worms and bringing Huss there, but then not living up to the promise he made that he would get safe conduct and standing up for what was right. So he's created a problem, and as was, it tended to be the go-to move for emperors, kings, church leaders at the time. Instead of admitting he made a mistake, he just decided, let's kill them all. The request was granted, and in 1420, Sigismund and his troops marched to the vicinity of Prague. And I love this whole thing that's about to happen. There they were crushed by the Bohemian army. These guys said, nuh-uh, you are not coming in here, and you're not going to get what you want. We are ticked off. We are right, and we are standing up for it. And so this first attempt in 1420, they got destroyed and had to get out of there quickly. But of course, that wasn't the only one. Sigismund attempted another attack in 1421, and they got crushed again. I mean, this is just piling on. They're tearing them up. Attacks against the Bohemians were also rebuffed in 1422. So they went 3 years in a row, 1420, 21, and 22. After that, they thought about it for a little while. They didn't come back until 1427, but they came back again, got their tails kicked again, and then in 1431, same thing. So think about that. 1420, 2, 1421, 1422. There's 3. The 4th one in 1427, finally 1431. 5 times they tried to go in there, and 5 times they got knocked right out. Then at the Council of Basel, it was determined that the Council of Constance had been unwise in its dealings with the Bohemians. Oh, you think so? Yeah. This next council came along and said, maybe we shouldn't really have taken that strong of a stance. We did burn a man at the stake, and we did basically say that we wanted to go out against every other person that agreed with him. So they said, Hussites, come on and join us. Come on down to the Council of Basel. Well, do you think that those people thought, you know what, it would be a great idea for us to go to this council? They're still remembering what happened to Huss. And they're thinking, I don't think we're going to just walk in there. So the Bohemians, since they were fearful of the treatment of John Huss, rightfully so, they made some demands for their safety. They thought, we're going to get something in writing this time. We're not going to just walk in there and get killed and just say, oops, sorry. And some council come along later on and say, oh, we probably shouldn't have done that. Well, those demands were not met. The people at the council got huffy about it. They didn't like that they were demanding these demands. They thought that it was already real big of them to invite them anyway. And so they thought, you know what? I think instead of us reaching out with an olive branch because we were wrong the last time we dealt with these people, let's just go back in and try to kill them again. So, yeah, this is a dark time in church history. So they want to have another crusade against Bohemia. Now, did they think about the last 5 times they went? Remember that saying, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it or whatever? Well, people are doomed to repeat it anyway, but they didn't study this history wasn't that long ago. It was just a few years ago. They got kicked in the teeth 5 times. They come back again because they're mad that they didn't just get taken up for their offer without any questions asked. And guess what? They get beat down again. So there's the 6th one, beaten again. Finally, after 6 times and this whole deal with the council, the church finally determined that, you know what? Maybe negotiations are a better idea. Rather, let's go in and get a bunch of people killed. So they made an agreement with the Bohemian church to retain communion in both kinds. That's one of the articles they wanted, and also to uphold several elements of the 4 articles. Many Hussites agreed to this. They looked at this as a win. They're always going to be that group that's going to cut off their nose to spite their face and say, if we don't get everything, we want nothing. So there were some like that. They broke away and they formed the Unitas Fratum. And that movement later on established close ties with Protestantism. So we'll get back to them at another time. But these are the little roots that are coming along. They're going to bring the Protestant Reformation about. And this is a big part of that as well. So let's look at another movement going on at this time. There's a big movement towards the mystical. And it actually becomes an alternative for those who are not happy with the way things are going in the Orthodox Church. The 14th and 15th centuries were a time when mystics abounded. One of the most famous ones, you may have heard his name before, maybe not, Eckhart von Hochheim, known as Meister Eckhart, was the great teacher of German mysticism. His doctrine was essentially Neoplatonic, and it focused on the contemplation of the divine. His intention was to exalt God by showing that no human concept can grasp the divine. For Eckhart, this meant that true knowledge of God is not rational, but intuitive. So Eckhart would argue that you can't even really put into any terms humans can express verbally anything about God. It's just not even possible for us to have those kind of ideas, those rational thoughts about God. So true knowledge of God cannot be rational. It's intuitive. It comes from experiencing Him and contemplating Him. It can't come from even verbalizing things about Him. God is known by mystical contemplation in which one is finally lost in the divine. So it's this idea, this very mystical idea of just being so caught up in who God is and the greatness of Him, and that you just lose yourself in that. And this was attractive to people at the time. From all eternity, all creatures are in God. Before the foundation of the world, the ideas of all things that would exist were in the mind of God. So I want to stop here and read a passage from the writings of Meister Eckhart for you that might help to understand a little bit about what he was saying, although it may not make sense. But this was something that he said that some people took and thought it said something that he didn't intend, I guess. And here we go, quote, "Within that true essence of the Godhead, which is beyond all being and every distinction, there I already existed. There I willed myself. There I knew myself. There I wished to create the man I am. For that reason, I am my own cause according to my being, which is eternal, although not according to my becoming, which is temporal." So you listen to that, it sounds like a bunch of words that don't necessarily make a lot of sense, but that also sounds like he's talking about human beings always existing or being pre-existent in some way, in a way that's not scriptural, and people took it that way. So more about Meister Eckhart. These views led many to think Eckhart was a heretic. It was thought that he believed that the world and all creatures were eternal, and that he confused God and the world, resulting in pantheism. And just from that little bit that I read you can understand why some people may have thought that. If you read it and take it without really any explanation, it's easy for anyone to look at that and draw some of these same conclusions for sure. He was also accused of believing that the soul, or part of it, was eternal rather than created. Again, easy to get that impression from what he said. Against these claims, Eckhart pleaded that he was the victim of mistaken interpretation. So he said, no, that's not what I meant by this. You don't understand what I'm trying to say. And he tried to avoid pantheism and the divinity of the soul, but his expressions often left him open to such interpretations. You can understand why it would be fair to make some of these accusations. If you read even more, I just read you a couple of sentences. If you read even more of his writings, you could see where this is coming from, and you might very well agree that what he's saying is not correct. Late in his life, he was finally accused and convicted of heresy. So finally the church came along and said, all right, we agree, this is heretical. But he appealed to Rome and wanted to try to clear his name, but he died before the case could be settled. But after death, Eckhart had many followers, most famous among them being John Tauler and Henry Suso. Tauler and Suso were successful in expounding his views in terms that were more accessible to those not trained in theology. So these guys were able to read what Eckhart said. They understood his intention. They understood what he was trying to say, and they made it to where people could understand it better. They explained what he was trying to say in a way that people could understand it. And as a result of that, Eckhart's mysticism gained widespread acceptance. So you can find books of Eckhart's writings to this day. I have one sitting on my bookshelf right now. And it's very easy to find his thought, and there are a lot of people that really like these mystical thoughts. And a big reason for that is some of the followers that came later were able to put the things he said in terms that people could a little bit more easily understand and get behind. Well, Eckhart certainly wasn't the only one in this mystical movement. John of Rusbrock, a Flemish mystic, contributed a more practical mysticism. Then there was Gerhard Groot, who was also Flemish and was largely influenced by Rusbrock. Rusbrock and Groot greatly contributed to what came to be known as modern devotion. This primarily consisted of a life of disciplined devotion centered on the contemplation of the life of Christ and its imitation. Eckhart wasn't really interested in anything that had to do with historical events. He didn't care that much about the narrative writings in the Bible, the stories of what happened in Israel, or even about the life of Jesus. He was more interested in just kind of what's happening right now mentally and mystically, being joined with God and fellowshipping with him and communing with him. That's why it's thought that Rusbrock and Groot were more practical. They were interested in the actual events of the Bible and the life of Christ. And they wanted to contemplate that just as much as anything else that you could contemplate. The most famous writing of this school that came along is The Imitation of Christ. It's a book that's been read for the years. You can still read it today. And it came as a result of this type of thinking. Rusbrock and his followers also contributed by rejecting the teachings of the Brethren of the Free Spirit. And this was a good thing. This was a group of mystics who claimed that they had a direct experience with God and therefore had no need of the Church of the Bible. Very dangerous thinking, and it still goes on to this day. The idea that my personal experience with God puts me in a position that I don't really need these other things. I don't have to read the Bible because I'm getting direct revelation from God. I'm not saying God doesn't speak to people, but you can't put even your own relationship with God and the ways that God communicates with you on the same level as Scripture, because that is an inspired thing that God did only for a certain amount of material. It was him giving a direct word to people that was without error. It superseded human error. So you can't put it on the same level. In the same way, you also can't think that you're just kind of a church unto yourself. You're a kind of a follower of Christ that's just a lone ranger type. The Bible says we need the church. We need to have community with one another. So the personal experience never can supersede the need for Scripture, the need for direct revelation from God, from His Word, and the need of the church. Again, this was something that was happening this time. These mystical guys, they refuted. They said, no, We're in with the mystic stuff, but we're not in with this. It doesn't supersede the church or the scriptures. And anybody that has that thinking now, that should be rejected as well. Groot founded the group, the Brethren of the Common Life. The group helped establish excellent schools that became centers for renewal of the church. Most of their alumni were possessed of a critical and reforming spirit. The most famous of these alumni was Erasmus of Rotterdam, a leading figure in the 16th century. Again, we'll get back to this guy later on. He was one of the people that helped bring about reform. This school that came about as a result of the Brethren of the Common Life, more than one school, that really helped to put those seeds down for Reformation that's coming. So everything that's going on in this time, it's setting up for reform. It's setting up for the need for reform. People are getting restless. Even those who are leadership in the church, as we're going to see as we go through this, are starting to notice there's some problems that need to be addressed. And it's not okay even just to do these councils. The councils are not taking care of it. They're not wanting to face the problems. They want to kind of just look at some surface stuff and, yeah, we all kind of agree this isn't good, but we're really not going to do anything about it. There's a need for reform. And that same feeling, it wasn't just one guy. It wasn't even just two or three guys that all of a sudden one day, this stuff was building and building and building. And we see it all through this time. Though these mystics of the 14th and 15th centuries did not oppose the church or its hierarchy, their teachings became a germ of doubt that in later years would increasingly weaken the authority of the hierarchy. So again, just what I said, the seeds are being sown. The little ideas are getting into people's minds that there needs to be something change. Maybe we don't know exactly what that is. Maybe we don't even all agree on what that is, but something needs to happen. And more, there's a willingness to say, yes, let's get this done. Let's see reform happen. And if it has to happen by a council or a leader, that's great. But if it has to happen by people even standing up enough to break away, then we're willing to do that too. And that's what's on the horizon. And very briefly, let's look at one more kind of collection of movements that were going on. These are popular movements. So far, we've looked at movements that were largely among those that were educated, those in the clergy, those among the nobility. But there are also movements going on among the common folk. We don't know as much about them because obviously those that were educated write things down. Those that were in leadership, the nobility, the hierarchy of the church, they're historical figures, so things are going to be recorded about them and taken notice of. Things that are going on among the commoners, the poor folk, are not necessarily going to be remembered the same way, but they weren't forgotten either. And we do know some of these things that were happening. The Lollards, we've talked about them. They went from village to village preaching the teachings of John Wycliffe. The teachings of Wycliffe were accepted among the common people because the teachings confirmed many of their hopes. So they're starting to hear some things that are going along with what they think as well. So instead of rejecting them as, hey, the church said this wasn't right, they're saying, no, we like what we're hearing. We agree with this, and we're going to take this cause up because it goes along with what we believe in our hearts need to happen as well. So it's a grassroots thing. It's a groundswell of a popular movement that's happening. Nothing in history happens in a vacuum. We study the big things, that the big events, the big dates, but almost without exception, that stuff is the result of years and years and many people building up this idea and this movement that's going to come along that will result in these huge historical events. And we're seeing with this, there is a groundswell, there is a grassroots effort. And it does have to do with some leadership, and it does have to do with some intellectual people in the universities and those that are writers. But it also has to do with these common people who are getting on board with what they're hearing because it goes right along with what they're thinking too. This was also true of the teachings of Huss, which spread among the people as well. Women found monasticism as practically the only way they had of living a life free from dependence on their fathers, husbands, or sons. So many women who were single didn't have anyone to take care of them or didn't want anyone to take care of them for many of them, they said, there is one place I can go. I can't necessarily go have a career, get a job. I can't be independently wealthy, but I can go to one of these monasteries and I can find a place there. And so that was attractive for women at this time. But when the monastic orders for women were restricted because of numbers, many women began creating their own monastic small groups. They weren't necessarily looked at as monastic groups, but they were just small groups of women that would come and live together. Now, that's the way these monastic groups started to begin with. They weren't sanctioned by the church when they started. And so they're really the tradition of the origination of the monasteries, the monastic groups, is happening here with these women's groups, but they were not accepted. The church enacted laws against them, and yet it didn't stop the women's groups, and eventually some men created their own groups as well. So here we go. The big thing to realize here are people, again, getting outside the bounds of the church, going outside of what is accepted by the church, even go outside of what is directly being taught by the church, joining their own groups together, not necessarily of orthodox thinking, but they are creating their own groups, and they are deciding that it's okay to make a stand against what the church is saying is right. So there's another movement as well. It's led by Hans Baum. He focused on the contrast between the commands of the gospel and the greed and corruption of the clergy. Baum amassed more than 50,000 followers and encouraged them to refuse to pay taxes and tithes. So Baum is another guy that's going against what they see as greed, what they see as corruption in the clergy, and he's trying to make a stand against that. Then Baum organized a march for his followers to go together to claim their rights. This was too much, and the bishop's soldiers arrested him and dispersed the crowd. Baum was burned as a heretic, but his followers remembered his message. So once again, a guy trying to stand up against the powers that be, he gets burned as a heretic, but people remember his sacrifice, and they carry on his message into this Protestant Reformation time. The last years of the Middle Ages were a time of unrest in which social causes joined with religious concerns. The tendency of the clergy to oppose movements seeking change and the elimination of corruption strengthened the resolve of the common people to resist the clergy in ancient hopes of justice. So, as we get down to these last years of the Middle Ages, things are about to start changing in a big way in society, but also in the church. We are seeing the very essence of the seed sown, the movements that's coming that's going to allow for the Reformation time. The dawn of the Protestant Reformation is truly happening, and it's not far off now. So as we're down now, this is episode 48. We've only got 2 more to go. Next week, we're going to look at kind of a wrap up in general of the end of the time of the Middle Ages and refocusing on where the church is then. And then the last episode, episode 40, we're going to look at some missionary work that's going on around the world that kind of is relevant to what's going to be coming as well. So 2 episodes to go. Thanks for being with me today for this edition of the History of Christianity. Look forward to talking to you again next week. God bless.